relocation movements, such as the Windrush era of the Caribbean, England, and the Great Migration within the United States. John Thornton's new work, African and Africans, The Making of the Atlantic World, and Adam Smith's classic, The Wealth of Nations, share a similar perspective regarding the objective and the focus of the Atlantic world. Ironically, the theme of these two works, the self-serving role of slavery by the Europeans, is conveniently scathed over. Theories previously in Eurocentric publications assert that the main objective of the Europeans was to forge a broader scope known as the Atlantic world itself. Africa did not harbor romantic notions of a European presence in Africa and in African affairs. Africans forcibly demanded that trade be conducted voluntarily among equals in the very beginning. Indeed, the Portuguese crown needed instruction to relearn these lessons in an equitable trade system several times over. Many times when the Portuguese would come to the very shores of Ghana and many of those countries, some of the Portuguese were a bit arrogant and self-serving. Those tribal leaders made them pay homage to them. And if you visit the west coast of Africa on any particular market day, very little has changed. It's a beautiful sight to see all the market vendors and people on the shores doing trade with people waiting for the ships to come in. But unfortunately, when the triangle trade began, a lot of that eroded. Europeans began trading with Africa for the sole purpose of enhancing their own capitalist trade. Eventually, the act of trading with Africa progressed to the act of feeding Africa, which unfortunately is still in progress today. Now, what happened when many times you may read about dislocation and migration during the current centuries that followed is nothing more than a new or advanced period of colonialization. Now they didn't have to necessarily go to Africa and involuntarily get people. They actually charged you passage money to come to America. And this is what happened in England. During the period of the Windrush era, which followed directly after World War II, they sent ships to the Caribbean islands. And they said, come to America, come to England. There's work for you. You can live comfortably, enjoy all the privileges of European culture. And many of these people departed. They took their families and they came to England. They were met with hostility, they were met with racism, there were riots. But these people had all the intentions of coming to the New World in order to enjoy a new and better lifestyle. Many of their descendants are still in England, and if you heard anything about the riots last month, those were the descendants of, many of them were descendants of those people that came in the Windrush era, and they were rioting because their development has been stymied. There's been no advancement. There has been much more with the British, the BNP, with the British National Party. There's been a rise in nothing other than I call Nazism in England. Because the feeling is they've exhausted their usefulness. We no longer need these people anymore. In America, we had at the same time, ironically, the Great Migration. I don't know if you study that. This period commenced a bit after World War I, and it went into full throttle after World War II. American industrial icons and giants were soliciting blacks to leave the farm and agricultural areas of the South to come and work in northern factories. The lure or the seduction was, you're not going to suffer the racism, you're not going to suffer the hostility, you're not going to be redlined in certain districts. If you do come north, you'll enjoy the opportunities that you were never afforded in the South. Families did. Many of you may be descendants of some of those people that didn't follow through and come north. Unfortunately, they met with even harsher conditions. They were restricted to the ghettos of Chicago, the ghettos of New York City, some of the ghettos of Washington, D.C. And it was the same thing. The benefit was they got a cheap labor force. The people could be exploited further, and they actually paid for their own passage to participate in neo-colonial in their own workers who come in, who work at scale salary, but they pay the indigenous people a measly amount for their labor. Okay? The Atlantic world continues to expand and encompass the Pacific world. China and India are developing world powers. Developing powers require raw materials. Africa is the source once again. Exhausted of human and mineral resources? No, not Africa. China now ventures in Africa are becoming supposedly purely mercantile, but we're finding out this is not the case. China wishes to engage in trade. It wishes to advance trade, and the raw materials are extracted for a small fee via Africa. Yet the Chinese pay a moderate price for those minerals that they need. The few that are hired by the Chinese are poorly paid and vulnerable to injury and death because there are no labor laws to protect their interests. As a matter of fact, China and India have a way of engaging themselves with the government to make sure that no laws are enacted that will protect the actual indigenous workers. This is not an uncommon policy in terms of the continent of Africa. That's something we've seen in the past. The oil industry of Africa, not the Middle East, supplies most of the fuel for America. This is something that we're not being made privy to. America's oil interests in Africa exploit the people and ignore the blatant violation of the human rights. England again prompts concern for Africa. The vast oil reserves found in many African countries are exploited by England. The African people obtain little of the profit because the neo-colonial governments installed by the European powers act in the interest of the European powers. Belgium and France, in pursuit of the mineral coltan. This is the vital mineral that is needed for computer chips and cell phones, inciting internal disputes in African nations, past and present. Other companies such as Nokia, Ericsson, Intel, and Sony lust for African resources. Many other legitimate sources of minerals can be found in Western countries such as Canada, Australia, or even South American countries such as Brazil. But in Africa, once again, resources can be obtained for global use with little or no fee. The global diamond market is almost entirely dependent upon the cheap labor and minerals found in Africa. Internal civil wars and conflicts are inspired, supported, and financed by European powers that profit from African strikes. In short and in summary, Africa of the past, Africa of the present, Africa devoid of the future will always be at the forefront of globalization involuntarily. Thank you. Good afternoon. So I'm going to talk about the astronomical achievements of the Dogon people, fact versus myth. And actually, I became interested in this topic as a graduate student at New York University when I read Ivan Van Serva's book, Blacks in Science. And I found it very fascinating that these ancient people had such detailed knowledge of, space. So these are some of the main points that I'm going to cover. I'm going to establish a migration timeline. We're going to look at the Sirius system. We're going to talk about Dogon cosmology, the great debate. We're going to look at data verification using Adonis, and then I'm going to wrap it up with my conclusions. And I'm going to try to do this as quickly as possible because, science can often get very technical, so just hang in there with me, okay? All right, so this is the timeline that I'm going to establish. As you know, probably the ancient Dogons originated in Egypt about 5,000 years ago and moved across the continent of Africa until they reached Mali after fleeing from invaders, drought, and also people who tried to convert them to the Muslim religion. This is just a picture showing the Nile flowing through the country. Nothing more specific other than the fact that the Dogon country is marked there.
these are the cliffs of Bandagara, where they actually live, and it runs from southwest to northeast direction, parallel to the river Niger. It's about a 600-meter escarpment. Now, the first person to actually go and talk to the doggone was a Frenchman by the name of Diaspora, if I'm saying that right, in 1903, followed by two French anthropologists, Riol and also Diderot, who made contact with the doggone in 1931. Now, this is the Sirius star system that I mentioned to you earlier. Now, picture A is a crude drawing that was actually drawn by Agatamelli, who's a blind hunter that we all had, spent a lot of time with and talked to about their cosmology. The second picture is a little bit different from the first, and I'll explain that to you after I explain the first one. If you look at picture A, it looks like an egg. They call the Sirius star the dog star. So if you look at the top, you'll see the letter B, and if you look at the bottom, you'll also see the letter B. So what you have is this star going in an elliptical orbit around A and also C. You can see both of those letters there. Now, Sirius A, the doggone called Sigitolo. B was called Potolo. And then, of course, C was Imayatolo. And those two pictures are slightly different. If you look at B, you'll see that Imayatolo is going around Sirius A. So C is going around A in picture B. But that's not the way the doggone actually described it. I hope you can see that picture. This is the way the doggone actually depicted it. So you'll see that Sirius C is in the middle with B and A revolving around that. Now, the Sirius star system is approximately 8.6 light years away. If that doesn't make any sense, that's 50 trillion miles. Okay, so it's one of the closest stars. And I've given you the stats on all three of them. You can see that Sirius A is twice the mass of our sun, about 25 times more luminous. So could you imagine that? You standing outside and the sun is 25 times brighter than what it is now. The radius is twice our sun, and the temperature is about 10,000 K, which is also twice our sun. Sirius B is slightly less massive than our sun, not as bright, but it fits into a radius that's size smaller than Earth, but it has a temperature of 25,000 degrees Kelvin, which is, 5 times more than what our sun is, and it has an orbit of 50 years around those two stars. Sirius C is the question, okay? We aren't quite sure if it exists, but if it does, it might be an M5 or M9 star with an orbit of approximately 6 years. Now, just to give you some idea of size, if you look at this picture, you can see our sun in comparison to Sirius. It's a medium-sized star, so it's not that big. Here is the constellation Orion. You see Betelgeuse, which everyone knows. It's the red star at the top of the constellation. And you can see Sirius to the right of the screen. Sirius is the brightest star in our night sky. Now, if you want to see that star right now, you have to get up awfully early, like 5 o'clock in the morning, okay, and look in the southeastern part of the sky, and you'll see that constellation. So you can use Orion also to find other stars. You can see from Sirius straight through the belt of Orion to Aldebaran, which is a star in the constellation Taurus, to find the Pleiades. You're probably wondering what is the Pleiades. The Pleiades is also called the Seven Sisters, but it's the logo for Super. Now, this is Orion, if you can see it, in the night sky over Arizona. Now, most stars come in groups, but Sirius is a known binary. It's has two stars, A and B so far, that we have definitely identified. But the significant thing about, stars that are in groups, and specifically the Sirius system, since we're talking about it, is that it's it's a binary star, so it has a companion. This is the life track of a low mass star. So all stars are born in the interstellar medium, as you can see there, and they move on to the main sequence when they fuse hydrogen into helium. And shortly, I say maybe 10 billion years after that, that's not so short, they become red giants, and after that they shed their outer atmosphere and become planetary nebulas and eventually white dwarfs. That's what Sirius B is. It's now a white dwarf. Now, the second picture at the bottom is showing a companion star. So we have Sirius A, Sirius B. Now, Sirius B in this picture is drawing matter from Sirius A. Okay? That allows the star to ignite. It's not a star, it's actually dead when it's a white dwarf. But once it steals matter from its companion star, it becomes a live star again. So it goes nova. And after that, it goes back to a white dwarf. Now, if it takes the path of stealing too much mass from its companion star, it goes supernova, which means it just explodes into space and it leaves no remnant, but there's a lot of debris. So this is what it looks like. There's the white dwarf in the middle with the planetary nebula around it. Here you can see Sirius A with its companion white dwarf, Sirius B. Now, the interesting thing about most white dwarfs is that they have very strong magnetic fields, they rotate incredibly fast, and they're very heavy. They're so heavy that they bend and warp space-time. What does that mean? If you take a trampoline and put some weights on the trampoline, say a 100-pound weight, a 25-pound weight, and a 5-pound weight, the 100-pound weight will make the deepest depression in the trampoline. Am I not correct? So that's what happens with in space with a heavy star. It warps the space-time. It causes light to bend around it according to its mass. So what scientists do is a technique called gravitational lensing, which allows them to calculate the mass of the star. And you'll see where they actually did this as I go on. So now we talk about doggone cosmology, which dates back to about 3200 BC. And the doggone did describe a third star in the Sirius system, which I told you is called Tolo, which is larger, lighter, and dimmer than Sirius B. They practice a traditional religion with a complex mythology. They believe in complementary opposites, ancestor worship, and they even had a doggone ritual called Sigi, which is what Sigi Tolo, the major star Sirius A, the name comes from, which is a 60-year ritual where they choose a new priest. So what happens, they choose the priest when the orbits of Sirius B, Saturn, and Jupiter are all in alignment. Now, the doggone also told Grial that Jupiter has 4 moons, Saturn has rings, and all orbit the sun. And if you remember your history in terms of astronomy, you know that Copernicus eventually talked about the sun-centric model, and the doggone had already figured that out. Okay. They also believe that Sirius was the axis of the universe, and from that all matter and souls were produced. So now I'm going to talk about where they actually came from. These are the nomos, okay? So they visited Earth thousands of years ago as an amphibious being, and they resembled, as you can see, merrymen and mermaids. Also, Egyptian mythology sort of depicts the goddess Isis as a mermaid too. So the nomos came to our planet in an ark and brought this knowledge to the doggone. Now this is where the great debate started. From 1931 to 1956, these anthropologists spent 30 years learning the way of life of the doggone. Diederman actually found some artifacts that were at least 400 years old that depict the Sirius configuration that I showed you earlier. Bessel, a German mathematician, actually used that technique of gravitational lensing that I described to you to look at small disturbances that's caused by gravitational attraction from an unseen companion to predict Sirius B. But it was actually Alan Clark who actually saw Sirius B for the first time. Now, Van Beek was one of the scientists that refuted Rial's, research, on the doggone. He said that Rial's methods were cloaked in secrecy and could not be confirmed or supported. This is Rial's daughter. She said that Van Beek's account of the doggone's history was motivated by politics. This guy, Noah Roche, also a scientist, said that the doggone actually learned what they know from this scientist who was passing through the region on a solar eclipse expedition. And this map you can see shows the path of the solar eclipse of April 14, 1893, that stretches across most of South America and also Africa. Temple is the guy who came up with the book called The Sirius Mystery, New Scientific Evidence for Alien Contact. He was convinced of evidence that he received from the Egyptians, Sumerians, and so forth, what the doggone got came from an alien source. Vaness has a hypothesis that there is a third body and that it has a 6-year orbital period, and his book is called Is Sirius Intrepid. These are two more scientists who actually did some research and came up with an orbital period of 6.3. This is an orbital analysis to figure out the amplitude that would actually show that the star has 6.3 orbit. So just to sort of sum up this, you can see here in this next graph, if you look very carefully, you'll see that the peak is at 6.3 years. This is some numerical data. I don't have time to go through all of this, but this shows that after about 3 years, the orbits become unstable. And finally, what I want to say is that they found that there's a possibility for a 6.3-year orbit around Sirius A, but not B. And this is the satellite that they use to, figure out satellite information that they use to figure out the orbits of Sirius B and to try to figure out if Sirius C existed. You can see they've covered Sirius A with a coronagraphic mask so that you can actually see the picture of Sirius B. And this is the techniques that they use to observe it and the times. These are more equations. So I would have to go through and explain all of this, the infrared photometry of Sirius B. This is showing that the theoretical and the observed data actually match. If you notice the first set of data points and move from the J band over to absolute magnitude, you'll see those numbers to match. And this is the graph showing that there's a close fit with the data because they used a pure black body star to show that the data falls on the line. So, to sum it up, the small companion, it can't be any bigger than 0.08 solar masses. Basically, because if you look here, you can see what a brown dwarf looks like, Jupiter and our Earth in terms of size. And to conclude, I just want to say that, there is a spiritual connection that scientists right now probably, don't really understand about the doggone people. The skies were much darker. The human eyes were probably adaptive to that darker environment. Politics, religion, and culture also play a role in what's happening with saying that the doggone people didn't know this science without the modern instruments. Thank you, and I apologize for running over.
Thank you, Garcia. Okay, moving on to our last panelist, we have Phyllis E. Cooper from Norfolk State University, and she will be giving a paper, and forgive me if I say this wrong, but it's titled The Plight of Selected Equatorial Guineans in Misabi, a short story by Juan M. Davies as compared with the Afro-Uruguayans in El Desarrollo de la Calle de los Tecos by Jorge E. Cardoso as it relates to social theater.
Buenas tardes. ¿Cuántos de ustedes hablan español? Uno. Solamente uno. Dos. Good. The teacher and me decided that I would take one quick, steal a few minutes from my presentation and ask you, since we're talking about this is the year of, we're celebrating the year of the presence of African people in the United States. And I just thought I'd ask you, how many of you know what would be the #1 language in the world? What do you think right now? What is the #1 language worldwide? I'm a language teacher. I just thought I'd ask. See. Long. Not French. I'm going to give you a clue. There are a whole lot of people on this planet that speak this language. Who might have the most people? Chinese. Mandarin Chinese is the #1 language in the world. What's #2?
Spanish.
Well, that's an intelligent and good guess, but it's the language we speak. English. English is the second most popular language, and this is according to a study in 2005. #3 is Espanol. So Spanish is pretty important. #4 is Arabic. #5 is Bengali, and like in Bangladesh over there near India. #6, Hindi. #7, Russian. #8, Portuguese. 9, Japanese. 10, German. French is #14. I've changed my topic today. said, she's supposed to be talking about my book. I am going to save that opportunity for another presentation, and this is the presentation I bring before you this afternoon. I'm entitling this Strangers in Their Own Skin, the vestiges of post-colonialism and the reconciliation of dual identity as it relates to social theater in el desalojo de la calle de los negros, which means the eviction of the street of the blacks in Uruguay. After the Egyptian and the Indian, the Greek and Roman, the Teuton, a member of Germanic and Celtic origin, and the Mongolian, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world. A world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in an amused attempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals, and one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. This applies to Afro-Hispanics as well, and this is a quote from W.B. Du Bois, The Souls of Black Folks. Social theater. What is social theater? Well, according to Juan Villegas, Spanish social theater is an institution that presents its unique cultural model on the stage of the country that is showing this dramatization. Nevertheless, social drama has some general elements, according to Torrente Ballester in Teatro Español Contemporáneo. And some of the things that he includes are economically weak. It focuses on that. It presents the audience with a problem that is going on in that country. It deals with the society, so the characters are representative of problems in a society. Now, in Uruguay, the connection between Spain and Latin America began during the colonial epoch. And during those times, all of the theatrical forms of Spanish America, honestly, were imported from Spain, the colonizer coming to Latin America. During the colonial period in Spanish America, there were two basic tendencies, theatrical tendencies. The Spaniards took their theatrical companies to this new world in order to entertain the peninsular, that's what we call Spanish from Spain, the peninsular nobility, and so that the conquerors could have had religious motives, and we know a lot about that. We hear a whole lot about that, right? I have so much to share. It's really hard to eliminate things, but they have to be there. I wanted to tell you something about the Uruguayans. The Uruguayan theater deals with social themes that are ethnic, of course. They deal with the history, slavery, folklore, their legends, their carnival. This is the essence of social theater, according to Juana Maria Ordonez Cook, a professor at the University of Missouri. But in spite of this rich heritage, there doesn't seem to be a lot of research on social theater, or even the theater in general in African American studies in terms of at least Uruguay. How many of you have heard of social theater before? Oh, good. Okay. You? In 1990, estimates estimates of the number of Uruguayans of African descent ranged from as low as 40,000 to as high as 130,000, about 4%. In Montevideo, many of them traditionally made a living as musicians or entertainers. Few had been allowed to achieve high social status. As many as 3/4 of black women aged 18 to 40 were employed in domestic service. In the interior, citizens of African or mixed descent were concentrated along the Brazilian border. Early in the 20th century, the traditional folkways of Afro-Uruguayans were captured in the Impressionist paintings of Pedro Vigario. Although vestiges of African culture survived in the annual carnival celebrations known as the Llamadas, Uruguay's black population was relatively assimilated in 1990. This is a quote from the CIA World Factbook. Nevertheless, you need to know that this social theater is something really special in this work, El Desalojo de la Calle de los Negros, which means the eviction of the street of the blacks. Some of the things that relate to the issue of being social theater are as follows. It captures a vast audience. It has a capability of vitalizing and affecting the present time. I have the challenge right now of translating my own paper to you in English. According to the author of this play, Cardoso, whom I had the privilege of communicating with via fax, he considers his play to be a part of a new theater. He calls it Nuevo Teatro Popular, or a new popular theater in Spanish America, for 3 reasons. It has its roots in the Afro-Uruguayan people. It relates to the black community and the white community of Uruguay. And besides the fact that the work was actually based on a real historic event. So El Desalojo, as it is popularly called, reveals the characteristics also of what we call teatro barrial, or community theater. And teatro barrial is also under the heading of social theater, and it appeared at the beginning of the 80s in Uruguay. In an interview with Cristina Rodriguez Cabral, a popular Afro-Uruguayan contemporary poet, she points out that Cardoso shows the remains of the demolition where this building that these Afro-Uruguayans were living in, which frankly would probably be to us a tenement, not the best place that someone would want to live, but they had bonded and they were uniting. And as a result of this, the military representing the colonizer, obviously, was threatened, and they wanted to destroy this unity. So they decided that they were going to evict the people from this building and just throw them out, I'll say, to pasture. So the spirit of the people is what kept them going, and it just is a testament to this is the way African Americans, people of African descent have been all over this world. We have to keep being persistent. We have to keep we have to be persevering. But we have some decisions to make about our identity. According to the play, one of the key quotes that is really one of my favorites from the main character, Coro, spelled with a K. He says in English, we weren't brought here by a stork in a beak from Paris to this rosy, cheery country, referring to the South America. We came from Ubangi Shari, a French-speaking country in Africa. And so the point is that in my way of thinking, Coro represents the past. He's nostalgic. He wants to maintain his African But he has an aunt, Doña Coca, who also has a dual role. And in her case, she represents not only the African past because she's a main character in the carnival, but she also wants him to get an education. And she's really not quite ready to embrace all of the past. She doesn't want to go to the past. She wants to keep going forward. And this is the identity issue, the dual identity issue that we as a people are constantly dealing with. Education is important, but we don't want to forget who we are. Being displaced from this particular tenement, it really, it just continues to underscore how we are so good at overcoming obstacles. Just overcoming and overcoming. The new reality is how do we navigate both? How do we maintain our identity and yet be a part of another society? We have to balance, and this is what the characters in this play, they had to balance being African while being Uruguayan. In both instances, they had to balance both. In conclusion, I realize my time is up. Boy, it hurts. But there are so many fascinating things in this play that I would love to share with you. But in conclusion, I leave you with this thought. As we explore the African diaspora, are we going to remain splendid, uniquely splendid? Will we be blended? Are we going to end it? Have a nice afternoon.
So, those are provocative words. Let's see, does anyone have any questions? We're a little short on time. We may be able to get a couple in. Any questions for the panel? Any questions from the panel to the panel? She wants to know what the mascot is. Bison. 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 Okay. Yes. If you wouldn't mind, shout, or you can come up to the mic.
I wanted to know, based on the presentation that you
Good morning, African sisters. Lovely presentation. It is good that we are here sharing as much knowledge of our African sense with our children. Question, however, there's a lot of things going on globally. Of course, we currently are experiencing the recolonization of Africa. And I wanted to find out, in all your spheres you dealt with, the recent history in the 1930s of Africans migrating to Europe. You must understand that that was not even a good thing for us as a people. I heard your presentation on the Syria system, and of course of our people in Uruguay. Now, one of the things that we realize is globally, this racism is really something that tends to hold us back as a people. In every effort that we are making to unite ourselves, we realize that as soon as the elements who are against us realize that our strength is in our unity, they'll come in and sabotage those efforts. Now, for the future generation of Africans here, what are some of the things you would suggest or recommend for us to keep on that path of trying to unite and, in a sense, coming up with a defense mechanism against the sabotage of our efforts? So I need a response from all three of you.
I think that we have to unite. Multiculturalism can be a positive thing, it can be a negative thing. But you have to remember, we are to many powers, we are the other. And we will remain the other until we realize realize who we are, and we can't blame anybody else for that, but we failed to do so.
Well, I just want to say, as a scientist, I think it's very important that we reach back to our community and work with students in our community and build strong programs that will engage our students in science so that they will want to consider that as a career. So I think that's very important.
I noticed, I didn't answer your question, believe it or not, but I noticed that there's a focus on the miseducation of the Negro. That book, someone is having something out there too, right? The author's name at this moment escapes me. Excuse me? Right, Carnegie Woodson. And I remember the fact that in his book, he talks about the fact that in so many words, it's good that we have integration, but the purpose of integration wasn't for us to lose our identity. So he had problems with that part of integration because some people felt that that's what integration meant. And that's what, to answer your question, I think that we can continue to be a multicultural people, but we have to we can maintain our identities, but I think we have to continue to share, as my colleagues are saying, you continue to share these things. Like my parents, when I was growing up, maybe we weren't getting certain bits and pieces of history in our classes, but they took the time to pull out the books and they said, this is so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so. This is where you come from. This is who you are. And that builds a confidence that no one can take from you. So once you get someone's confidence up, then to me, it's difficult to destroy their identity. So I think what's happening today is that young people in general, I'm making a very general statement, it's not fair and it doesn't apply to everybody, but some are not being blessed with that opportunity, so they don't really know who they are. And when you don't know who you are, then it's easy for someone to persuade you to become just like they are. Now that's my answer.
Well, actually, I had a very similar question, but I wanted to ask about what's going on in Africa right now, like with Libya. What do you guys think about Gaddafi's position right now? Because he actually was trying to unite Africa at one point. What do you guys think about that idea? Can you repeat the question?
She was asking about how do we feel about what's happening in Libya and also with regard to Gaddafi. Unfortunately, Gaddafi fell victim to America, he fell victim to Europe because he was receiving funds. And anytime you're receiving money from someone, you play the pipe. And America, as it is always done, they turn you. They turn you.
But what do you think about his idea of unification?
Unification, if you look at that's an old premise that when Nkrumah had started, and you know what happened to him, and you know what happened to Du Bois, and you know what also happened to Richard Wright. These people disappear or go from us under mysterious circumstances.
Thank you.
So you say that the relationship between the triangle trade is strong in Africa originally.
Yes.
What was the catalyst that caused it to degenerate?
It was easy as a rule. It's easy to exploit Africa. There's no one looking. We don't look out for ourselves. Africa is the most exploitable continent on the face of the earth. You can't go into China and sell African goods without first getting sanctioned from the Chinese government. They won't let you do that. You can't go into many parts of South America, which the gentleman is speaking. You have to get permission to do that. Chavez is doing an excellent job of that in Venezuela. But you can go into any African village without sanctioning, without any type of licensing, and take off and exploit the people. And you can do that pretty much in any urban ghetto without anyone asking any questions.
So you would say a lack of
a lack of concern among Africans. We should, as African Americans, we should not let what's going down in Africa go without some question. We're allowing it to happen. African Americans are the wealthiest blacks on the face of the earth, but we do nothing for our people in Africa.